Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Ricky Bevington. I'm president of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. The council is a nonpartisan membership and grant-supported organization. We are Atlanta's premier global affairs resource for the city's corporate executives, elected and civic leaders, universities, consulates, members of the media, and of course, members of our public community. You can sign up for our newsletter, find information about becoming a council member at our website, wacatlanta.org. And our media sponsor for today's event is the Atlanta Press Club, a wonderful friend to the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. Welcome to members of the Georgia media community who are in attendance today. We have a great group who are on this Zoom now. I'll just mention a few special welcomes to our council board members, Joe Bankhoff of the Sam Nunn School of International Studies at Georgia Tech, attorney and former Georgia Attorney General Sam Olens, Emory University Professor Jagdeep Sheth, two retired council executives, Ambassadors Charles Shapiro and Cedric Suzman, David Weiner, Quebec delegate to the Southeastern United States, Katie Kirkpatrick, President and CEO of the Metro Atlanta Chamber. We have representatives from several Atlanta consulates, the Ukrainian World Congress, several World Affairs Councils around the country. And the truth is, everyone who joins our events is a VIP in our eyes. So thank you for taking this hour with us. I'm so excited to have Idrees Kahloon, Washington correspondent with The Economist, here today to spend this time talking with us a range of topics. We're going to be talking about what it's like to report for The Economist, which is a slightly different perspective than we're used to as Americans. Obviously, Idrees will be talking about Washington's response to Ukraine and the State of the Union address by President Biden. We're going to be talking about changes to election law and Georgia's midterm elections and other, I'm even going to ask Idrees what books he's reading. So please stay with us for this hour. We will go to question and answer as soon as we can. So please use the the Q&A function to be able to ask Idrees whatever question is on your mind. Idrees, thank you for joining us.
Sure, thank you for having me.
Where are you joining us from?
I'm joining you from Kentucky, actually. It's where my family still lives, so I'm here for the week.
And you grew up there?
Yeah, I grew up in Lexington, Kentucky. That's right.
Well, fantastic. You know, I want to jump into everything, but I think let's start by reminding our audience who may not be Economist readers or listeners, because you have a lot of podcast options. You know, the editorial approach of The Economist, what makes it a little bit different from maybe other mainstream media organizations?
Yeah, well, there are a few differences. One of the most stark is that most of all of our articles really are still not bylined. That's been the case since 1843, when you know, the founder and his brother-in-law were writing the majority of the articles, and they didn't want everyone to know it was written by two men only. So it's stuck. You only see vestiges of that legacy now in other media, generally in the form of editorials that are unsigned. But in The Economist, it is a publication that's written by many hands and often speaks with one voice, which is obviously distinctive. The other is that, unlike, you know, this is more common to British media than American media, where in the American media there's often a very hard firewall between opinion news and just the regular news operation, to the point that they even have separate copy editors and digital designers and these sorts of things. And in British media, the two lines are a bit closer to each other. And with The Economist in particular, what we offer is not sort of straight reporting that's a view from nowhere. All of our articles tend to have an analytical take. And what we try to do is walk you through the logic of our writer, as to why we are advancing a point. So oftentimes, you know, what we call a rubric, which is basically the thesis of the piece, is an argumentative one. It's one that we advance. And so if you read an Economist piece, which is, you know, generally written, I think, reasonably well, you know, with a certain amount of wit and craft, there will often be a point, which is, you know, a distinctive thing. And the other thing I'll mention in passing is that, you know, the majority of our publication is devoted to foreign affairs. We have colleagues all over the world, you know, actual staff writers, not just freelancers in in China, South Korea, Brazil, Africa. I mean, most important places in the world. We have one full staff member who's writing, and I think is writing really, really well.
When I was promoting this event, Idrees, on my LinkedIn, I wrote something like, one reason that I trust the Economist is because they're willing to consistently offer sober, constructive criticism of both Democrats and Republicans, which I certainly appreciate as an American trying to navigate our own domestic media landscape. You wrote some sober, constructive criticism of the State of the Union. Talk to us about this article that you wrote about Joe Biden's speech.
Well, the article was a bit critical of him, especially in comparison to some of the other write-ups. But in my mind, there were two very distinctive segments, if you remember that from a few weeks ago. The first was a foreign policy speech about the events that had just begun in Ukraine, the war that had just begun. And Biden, I think, was in pretty good form on that because of his background in foreign policy, and because, although he's not a very gifted speaker, when he goes into the sort of stirring discussion of democracy versus totalitarianism, et cetera, he sounds pretty good, and he sounds convincing, and he looks presidential and all the rest. I thought that the second portion of the speech, which was his sort of recitation of domestic policy, was a bit tired. And there are two reasons for that. One, State of the Unions often do devolve into laundry lists of objectives of presidents. But in this case, Biden had obviously spent a lot of his presidency pushing a big domestic agenda that he called Build Back Better, which had just recently stalled out kind of dramatically in the Senate. And he was still clearly bracing from that. And not only was he, half-heartedly trying to pitch some of those components to get through, he wasn't really trying to sell any new ideas either. And I think that, what started off strong ended a little bit weakly, at least for me, on that State of the Union.
So you would argue that currently Biden is strong on foreign policy, at least vis-a-vis Ukraine, certainly not the withdrawal of Afghanistan, I assume, but soft, but not doing well in domestic policy. How do you think that those two assessments will play out over the course of 3 years?
So, let me start with domestic policy first, just because that's what I cover a bit more closely. But I think Biden could actually point to a few things that he's done. The bipartisan portion of the infrastructure bill passed. The American Rescue Plan was a very large bill. What I think his difficulty is a game of expectations, where he pitched a Rooseveltian style New Deal reorientation of the American economy, Johnson's Great Society, something along these lines. He was pitching for his place in the pantheon of great presidents by this agenda that he called Build Back Better. And so because he set expectations so high with the Senate majority that was, razor thin, when those failed, as probably was likely to happen in the first place, everything else that he's accomplished in Congress looks to be underwhelming, because, the American public has been told for months and months and months that, the president's agenda is this big thing that is happening. And obviously when it doesn't happen, it's going to be demoralizing to the base. And et cetera. I think on foreign affairs, certainly the Afghan withdrawal, was roundly criticized, not only by Republicans, but by some Democrats as well. You see, people like Robert Menendez, who's the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, it was very open to criticizing the president on his handling of that. And what we saw also was, a pretty sharp decline in the president's approval rating around that time. It's remarkable that Biden has an astonishingly low approval rating. It's as low as Donald Trump's was at this point of his presidency, which was, again, among the lowest of any president of the modern era, basically any era in which we've had polling. Some of that is due to polarization and the fact that, half the country is almost lost to begin with, but it really does reflect the degree to which the president has not met the expectations that he set out for himself. Now, on Ukraine, he certainly, in my mind, has handled things much better than he has in Afghanistan. And if you look at if you again look at polling, and you ask Americans sort of decision by decision, what do you agree with, for example, these enhanced sanctions on Russia? Do you agree with providing military aid to Ukraine? Do you disagree with putting a no-fly zone over Ukraine? Do you disagree with direct confrontation of American and Russian troops? Solid majorities of both parties agree with basically every decision the president has made. Now, that has not meant that his approval rating has gone up at all. At least from last I checked this morning, from 538, the polling approval. For as much as Americans agree with him, there hasn't been a rally around the flag effect of any kind. So, it might be frustrating for him, even though he's probably handled this foreign policy decision very well. And excuse me, NATO is more unified than I think Vladimir Putin expected. Domestically, at least, it doesn't seem to be booing him that much. And I think all of that sets him up for this metronomic effect that you see where Americans elect a president of one party in a year, and in the midterms, they tend to punish them. There have only been two exceptions to that trend. One was 1998 with Bill Clinton after he survived impeachment, and the second was 2002 for George Bush after 9/11. Basically, every other midterm election since FDR, really, we've seen a substantial decline for the party in majority, and that suggests that Democrats are going to do fairly poorly in the upcoming midterm elections, especially given the president's approval rating.
I hear plenty of criticism from colleagues and contacts who are not Democrats and have never supported Joe Biden, and they say that Putin did this now because Biden is weak. But there's obviously a larger picture. Can you remind us? Obviously, the German elections changed things. I mean, it's just a perfect storm, it feels like. And I'm happy to have you address sort of the larger context of this invasion. But let's go back to focus on Joe Biden. Did Putin invade Ukraine because Joe Biden is weak?
I find that a very simplistic analysis of what's gone on. Like you said, there are a lot of things that are happening. One is, in Germany, Angela Merkel steps down, and she had been his primary interlocutor, who could speak for Europe. Actually, Angela Merkel was fabulous at Russian, won a school competition when she was young. And Putin's German is fantastic. So they were both able to speak to each other in their native languages, which I think went some way for them. But aside from that, there are, I think, a few other things that mattered as well. One is the fake election in Belarus, and the near ousting of Putin's close ally Lukashenko there, and the forced suppression with the aid of Russia in suppressing democracy on Russia's borders. I think that's one factor that we have to think about. And second, I think a lot of intelligence folks think a lot about Putin's informational diet, and it seems to be quite restricted. He seems to, at least from what I've heard, not use personal electronic devices. He seems to get a lot of information from briefings directly with generals and military intelligence, etc. And he seems also to have dramatically cut off contact with other points of intelligence since the COVID-19 pandemic. He does seem to be genuinely a bit more removed. And the third is that obviously this Ukrainian aggression did not come out of nowhere. Putin has for a long time suggested that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was a terrible mistake. He obviously invaded in 2014 and seized part of Crimea. And obviously he's getting to a point now where he's been in power for more than 2 decades. And if you read his speeches closely, you often see, interestingly, a sort of begrudging admiration for Stalin, and despite his excesses and brutality, an admiration for what he did at a time when Russia or the Soviet Union was strong. And I think that suggests to me that Putin is thinking about how he can place himself within the pantheon of great Slavic leaders. I think that is genuinely something that he is considering, and he wants to be in the same sort of category as Stalin or Alexander Nevsky, or all these sorts of folks. And I think that that's also an important psychological driver for him. But ultimately, what we are having to do is decipher the psychology of one man who is perhaps the most guarded in the world at the moment. And so that's obviously going to be a difficult task, and ascribing it to, I think, President Biden's momentary weakness or whatever is a little bit simple for my mind.
I'll invite our audience to submit your questions using the Q&A function on this Zoom. Idrees, is it too soon to say whether Ukraine will determine Biden's presidency?
I think it is a bit too soon, given that, the bombing of Ukraine is continuing. And I think, unfortunately, that we're going to be stuck in a bit of a bloody stalemate for a while. But the reason I don't think it'll be determinative is that Ukraine still feels far removed for a lot of Americans. American troops are not directly involved. I was just in London for a few weeks, working at our offices there. The Ukrainian crisis feels a lot more immediate to Europeans, given that it's on the same continent, given that this is war that is happening in a place where war was supposed to, have been close to eradicated. But come back to America, and the Atlantic divide really does feel there, where the Ukrainian, tragedy is, as awful as it is, doesn't feel to be, the primary topic that people are focused on. And so I think that when people, make their political decisions and such, they won't be doing it primarily based on Ukraine or how it all goes.
Well, we've long known that Americans vote often in response to economic factors, kitchen table issues. Inflation is the biggest topic. Well, maybe not inflation itself, but the price of goods was what's being discussed around American dinner tables right now. How will I should say inflation as a result of Ukraine and also the pandemic and fiscal policy influence the midterms coming up?
I think inflation might have a bigger impact directly on voting behavior than Ukraine. Americans were already fairly upset about it before this war began, and obviously the effect is going to be even worse. There's going to be a commodity shock with oil, although the prices has dropped a bit recently. Commodity shock to wheat. Supply chains for things like electric vehicles and minerals and these sorts of things will also get snarled up by sanctions, and all of that, I think, is fairly significant, and we'll have COVID was already a supply shock to a lot of places, and this is just an added supply shock. And so the difficulty also is that unlike a demand shock, where the answer would be greater fiscal stimulus, supply shock is a bit tougher to unsnarl yourself from through fiscal policy and monetary policy. And I think that there's a pretty credible argument now that the $2 trillion that was spent very quickly as a result of the American Rescue Plan really only accelerated inflation. A lot of other countries have had significantly higher inflation, greater than 2%. But America hitting 7% is kind of a league of its own. And I think that it's very aggressive fiscal stimulus throughout the pandemic, but especially at the start of the Biden presidency, will have hastened that perhaps a bit too quickly.
You, of course, live in Washington. You are the Washington correspondent, and you talk to members of Congress all the time, I would imagine, and also experts. And so what are they saying now? What are you hearing just anecdotally about what Congress's role is? And take out the politics. We've all heard the talking points, but what's your real analysis, given how close you are to those discussions?
Congress's role on inflation or Ukraine?
Well, I think how Congress sees its role, not on Ukraine, although I realize I didn't ask you about that, but just since we're focused on inflation at the moment, and we can go back to Ukraine. What are the conversations among members of Congress about the inflation point, taking out, how it may harm or hurt their chances and their party's chances in the midterms?
I think it's actually very hard to take the politics out in terms of analyzing people's reactions to midterms. Republicans see it as their winning ticket for the midterm elections, and it's particularly advantageous to them given the absence of a policy platform of their own. Um, and Democrats also, I mean, the solution that they have pitched to inflation is, well, this just demonstrates that you need to pass our agenda wholesale, because it includes some, supply side. Janet Yellen and others have tried to rebrand a sort of new supply side economics where they would increase the productive capacity of the economy by investing in healthcare and childcare and all these other things. So really, the reaction to inflation has just, completely refracted and bifurcated into, the usual points. Republicans are going to say this just demonstrates that Democrats are bad at managing the economy, and Democrats are just saying, well, this just demonstrates that we need to, pass the entirety of our agenda wholesale. So, and that's the same thing you get that same answer when you talk to people, on background and off the record as you do, on the record. I mean, I think they do genuinely believe this, through and through.
So there's no chance of getting members of Congress to just have sober responses to anything. It has to be only political.
There are a narrow set of issues on which you can find some degree of accord, and I think you saw some of that in the bipartisan part of the infrastructure bill that passed. Things like highway funding and broadband and these sorts of things, you can find some common ground on. But it's hard. There are some areas that have seeming confluence of bipartisan interests. Take antitrust, for example, where when you examine them closely, you see that the two are coming from very different sides. So both, a sizable number of Democrats and Republicans agree that big tech is too big, and we need much tougher antitrust regulation of both. Okay, look at Warren versus Josh Hawley and the reasons for that. Warren basically thinks that anything that's too big is sort of inherently suspicious and basically too bad. And she begins with the premise that they should be broken up because they are too big. And Hawley's points are, that big tech is complicit in the censoring of conservative Americans, and that's why they need to be broken up. So when it comes down to actually crafting policy that would achieve these aims, because the two are pointed in such different directions on the rationale for that, you end up with difficulty in actually setting that up. Similar issues with, there's a general bipartisan consensus that America needs to be tougher on China, the great power that it's competing with, but a lot of disagreement on how exactly that should be done. There's a lot of disagreement, for example, on whether or not we should trade with China, particularly to source the materials needed for electric vehicles. A lot of Republicans are very against that. On Ukraine as well, right? There's a huge amount of bipartisan support for the Ukrainians against Russia, but that has not inhibited Republicans from being acrimonious about Biden's response and being critical of Democrats as they try to craft these aid packages and such. So I think it's really quite inescapable at this point.
Assuming that history continues its consistent march toward having presidents punished at midterms and Republicans win majorities at the federal level, how do you think that federal policy could change toward Ukraine under Republican leadership?
Well, Biden would still be president, so any packages would need to be agreed to with both. The aid that is being sent, both military and humanitarian, I think there's a good degree of support there. So I don't anticipate there being a sort of dramatic change in orientation towards Ukraine on this regard. And I think in foreign policy generally, presidents are uniquely capable of acting unilaterally in a way that is not true of their domestic agenda. So I think I would expect to see much more continuity on the foreign policy space because the president can act quite unilaterally over the next 2 years, regardless of the outcome of the midterms. But where you will see dramatic change is in Congress and domestic priorities. So uh, you would have to kiss Build Back Better goodbye if Republicans took office, and it had not passed since then. And I think you would get probably a repeat of the self-created fiscal crises that we had when Barack Obama was president. If you guys remember sequestration and those sorts of debates, shutdown debates, et cetera. Because the president and Congress have to agree on budgets and all the rest, that will be the side of dramatic showdowns. And I expect that we would spend the next 2 years just dealing with those, as opposed to crafting significant and meaningful policy.
We have some great questions coming in the Q&A function. I want to just get a few more in for you, Idrees, before I hand it over to our audience. And I will be reading the questions. You and I spoke before this, and you said you were hoping to make it to Georgia ahead of the primaries, I think. What are you looking for? What trends are you seeing, or what interesting story threads are you seeing in the Georgia midterms and the gubernatorial race?
Yeah, I mean, Georgia's a fascinating state right now. I mean, the Purdue Kemp primary is fascinating to me. I think you mentioned that Kemp in 2018 was the right-wing outsider challenging Casey Cagle, and now he's sort of being flanked from his right himself by Purdue.
Yeah.
And the basic, I think the fault line, or at least from what I can tell from Purdue's press releases, is that Kemp basically did not abet Donald Trump in stealing the election, and that's his primary sin. And I think he poses a meaningful chance of beating him in the primary on the basis of that single issue, which is, I think, a reflection of what we're seeing across the country in Republican primaries as well. There were 10 Republicans in the House who voted to impeach Donald Trump after the January 6th attack. I think many of them, if not most, could be outside of could be evicted from the primaries as a result. Certainly Liz Cheney and others will be. So I think that's going to be a meaningful one. Precisely finding out the effects of the voter ID laws, I think, will be interesting. I think that a lot of the reporting on that has been a bit overheated, in part because when we try to examine the actual effects of some of these tighter voter ID laws, we often find that they're quite muted, that they don't have strong partisan leanings one way or the other, and that's partially because they affect Republicans and Democrats both. Although it's basically become part of the Democratic agenda to say that these threats are real and that they're actively suppressing votes and all the rest. I'm more concerned about the outright sort of electoral subversion that we saw attempted in the previous election, and that I think might be at play as well. Obviously, Stacey Abrams has become kind of a national figure of some prominence. Whether she can maintain her, whether or not that translates in a state like Georgia, where obviously you have Atlanta that's going to go heavily for her, but you also have the rest of the entire state, which is probably very much hostile to her. I think will be really interesting to see whether she campaigns as the sort of progressive icon that she's become in like New York and DC. I think that would obviously go quite poorly for her. So it'll be interesting to see how she navigates that, to me. But yeah, anyway, it's a very interesting state, and I look forward to spending some time here.
And who she ends up opposing, Kemp or Purdue, will, I would imagine, determine her own narrative. Or I don't know, I just would say that any good politician is going to tailor their messaging to their opponent. That's just a comment more, but you're welcome to respond to it.
No. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that her handling of her loss to Kemp and basically saying that it was stolen was actually, if you're worried about eroding democratic legitimacy, I think that statements like that, even if they come from the left, are also problematic. So I hope we don't get a repeat of that, but uh, obviously the two will be so far apart on basically every policy issue that as has been the case at the federal level. I mean, the state level, we see the complete sort of polarization of America continue, I think.
Well, since the Atlanta Press Club is our media sponsor for this event, and I'm speaking to a reporter, I will put in my personal request to see more reporting about who votes in primary elections and why. Because we often talk about, XYZ candidate isn't going to win because their agenda is too radical or their talking points. And yet when so few members of the Democratic or Republican Party vote in primaries, that tiny percentage of people end up determining the statewide candidate. And I think that just sort of gets overlooked. But I'd ask you to respond to that.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. Political scientists have been raising that, I think, for a while as well. Primary turnouts are often, even in hotly contested one, maybe 30% or something. And obviously the most ideologically motivated people are going to be the ones that are joining, right? And so their preference set is going to be different from ordinary general election voters. And the toxic element is that because political scientists have this term that they call negative partisanship, which is this idea that my hatred for the other side is so large that I countenance whatever sins I see in my own party because it has become so utterly tribalistic. And so the problem is that there isn't really a corrective mechanism at the general election either, because even moderate leaning voters, when confronted with the choice, still opt for their own party, right? They don't. I mean, 90% of people who voted for Mitt Romney in 2012 voted for Donald Trump, despite the two being, I think, fairly opposite on many important distinctions, including their commitment to basic democratic tenets. But those forces are the combination of the two, I think, is particularly destructive for American politics.
And you have written extensively on trust, both in elections and in media and in Americans' trust of each other. And I'm not sure we're going to have time to address all of that today because we've got some great questions coming in. So before we go to questions, just a reminder to use the Q&A function. And conversations like this one are made possible with member support, and you can find information about becoming an individual or corporate sponsor of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta at our website, wacatlanta.org. And now on to I can already tell our fantastic questions. Let me just open up the Q&A. We have actually a question back to Ukraine. This is obviously on top of people's minds. Connected to Ukraine and domestic, the midterms, Ambassador Charles Shapiro says, Republicans blame gasoline prices on Biden, Democrats blame gas prices on Putin. Which argument will carry the day?
I think, unfortunately for Democrats, they will bear the costs of high gas prices. American voters often blame the party that's in charge. Truman identified this when he said that the buck stops here, and I think that's going to be the case. I think it's Democrats have to attempt some kind of messaging, and so they're saying Putin's price hike. I think worth a try, but ultimately I don't think it will be successful. I think that gasoline prices will matter, and the people that will be blamed will be Democrats for that.
We have a question. In the Ukraine war, the Biden administration has been criticized for telling too often what it would not do, i.e. create a no-fly zone. From a strategic point of view, should any force, aggressor, or defender say anything about its strategy, maybe not even say what the US will do? I understand you're not a military strategist, but you've been covering this. So do you have an answer for that question?
I think they have been clear about some of the things that they would do and have done, and I think that that was the case with the sanctions that they put into place. I think that they I think that the sanctions that were levied against Russia were more severe than they anticipated. For example, sanctioning the central bank, canceling Nord Stream 2, cutting off Russian banks from SWIFT, et cetera. And I think that there is an argument to say that the Biden administration could have been more specific um, ahead of Russia's invasion, because when the totality of these sanctions are made clear, their deterrence effect could have been significant. And once Putin had committed to sending troops to Ukraine, obviously, the punishment will be borne, but the chances that he would relent, I think, was gone. So the leverage that sanctions could have had, I think it's reasonable to say that there was a missed opportunity there, but perhaps it was, they didn't want to overcommit, given that Europe appeared on the cusp of the war a bit more divided than it seems now. And I think Putin had expected that to be the case, that that there would be disagreement, particularly from the Germans, over the gas supplies and other things, and even domestically within countries. As some parties are a bit more pro-Russia than others, that there would not be this sort of unified response. So perhaps that's the result. I think that they could not have declined to specify their position on the no-fly zone, given Zelensky's insistence that this be imposed. And so, obviously, you want to avoid a Obama no red line on chemical weapons and then non-interference sort of scenario. But if the president of the country that is being attacked, who you are allied with and are supplied with weapons, is insisting on a no-fly zone, I think eventually they would have had to made a decision. And I think that one's justifiable. And I think saying explicitly that we don't want to do anything that will risk a nuclear war with Russia, I think is arguably responsible statecraft. So, I understand the critique, but I think that there are some reasons for the way that they've done it the way that they have.
Well, not the least of which is that, unlike Putin, our leaders who are running this war from our perspective are accountable to us. So in a democracy, they have to share with us what their thinking is, what their strategy is, as much as they can. It's part of the system. Now, we would not want our president to stand up and lie to us, certainly, but if he has to change his mind, he has to change his mind, or Congress can change his mind for him, right? So that's my own personal commentary about how the American democracy works, that he's managing domestic, Americans' expectations as well as Putin. We're all reading the same speech that he's given. Jerry Strickland asks, if you had 30 minutes with President Biden, what would you advise him to do quickly to slow and reduce real inflation for the individual struggling to balance income and expenses? Thank you for that question, Jerry. I don't know if Idrees is an economist either, but he might be. He's multi-talented. So what is your answer to that, Idrees?
Yeah, I guess it's a strange role to think of advising. But I think the big thing that needs to be done, that is already being done, would be the Federal Reserve increasing its rates, and actually tapering off quantitative easing. It's kind of interesting. 10 years ago, or even longer, 14 years ago, when quantitative easing started, it was thought of as this emergency measure, and it's persisted, at sort of incredible volume for so long. Obviously, that's not the president. The Fed is independent, but I think that in terms of actually staunching real inflation, the most important thing will be the Federal Reserve's actions there. It's difficult. Like I said, a lot of other countries are experiencing inflation that is high, but not as high as America. I think you need to look at where avenues in which your foot is on the pedal, where it ought not to be. There are some unspent money from the American Rescue Plan and other COVID packages that I would take a good hard look at, whether or not they still need to be spent. A lot of that money, 350 billion of it, was sent to states on the premise that their budgets were in shortfall, and that's not the case. Their budgets, I think, declined by about 2% because of all the other support that was given to them. So there are states now that are contemplating doing things like sending basically extra stimulus checks to people with the unspent money, and that's obviously a policy that you would want to nix. You know, unless it's better targeted or anything, a indiscriminate stimulus check in the midst of current economic predicament, I think would be a poor decision. So I would look at that. There are also, I mean, a lot of the tariffs that were put in place under Donald Trump have not been lifted, including on some close allies like Canada, certainly China, on which there are more serious concerns. But I would closely examine and undo the tariff restrictions that are unnecessary. And at a deeper level, if you read Biden's speeches quite closely, he's very insistent on, America. You saw this in the State of the Union, on American supply chains and union built things, and using procurement to benefit unionized American workers. That's going to be in tension, at least, with efficiency, and as a result, that might have some spillover effect on inflation. So I would examine that. Obviously, the democratic solution is you should just pass our agenda. If he could do that, I'm sure he would. But I don't have any specific advice on how to do that on that part of it.
Well, I think both parties would say, well, the solution to everything is to just do what we think is right. It's not just Democrats, although they just happen to have the power at this moment. We shall see after November. We have a couple of questions about China, so I'll go to that direction since you brought up China, and I'll just condense them and ask you to comment on China's role. And I think it's a good thing to point out, Idrees, that you are part of a whole ecosystem of reporters, and you have incredible reporters in China, and I assume Russia and Ukraine. I'll ask you to comment on the Economist staff that are on the ground currently in the conflict, but you're able to rely on this extensive network of people to help give you insights in your own reporting. So what are Economist correspondents in China telling you, and what is your own analysis of, and this is a very vague question on purpose, China's role in this, and our relation, how it will impact the American relationship with China?
Well, first, I have fantastic colleagues who write our China coverage. A few of whom are based in China, who speak Mandarin and understand it much better than us, or much better than me, I should say. So I benefit substantially from having that. We actually ran a cover, I think last week, on China and Russia and that relationship, particularly as Russia looks to China as a sort of ally against the West's sanctions regime, against it. And what's interesting when you read the reporting from my colleagues, which I'm just parroting back to you, I'm no special sort of understanding of the situation, but a Russia-China alliance is not one that China would see as a partnership of equals. They would see Russia as a sort of junior ally, a provider of crucial raw materials and the rest, and not, Putin clearly has these aspirations to restore Russia to the position of global hegemon, and even if China assists him in spiting the West, they won't be part of the triumvirate. Despite that, I think the reality of a bipolar sort of U.S.-China schism is still going to remain the real one. But but I think that the reporting that we do on China is really extraordinary, particularly compared to the West. My colleague David Rennie, who writes the Chagwan column, is fantastic. Speaks Mandarin and many other languages, and is very well connected, and I think I always read his stuff and learn quite a lot from it. And it's also an area of focus for us. We're hiring a lot of people to be able to cover that important part of the world really well.
And the World Affairs Council of Atlanta actually hosted David Rennie about 6 months ago. So that conversation is up on our YouTube channel. So those who are interested can go and take a look. And I'm a personal big fan of David Rennie as well. We actually have a question from Nicholas Wooliver, and this is a journalism question. How many Economist contributors report from Russia? Are they still in Russia, or did they have to exit, or in the process of exiting or staying? What's the safety and status of Economist reporters in Russia? And I'll just add Ukraine onto that.
We have reporters in Ukraine. Last I heard, at least 3. Russia's become much harder for us to report from, and I'm not sure I should say much more on that. But like everyone else, it's become very hard for us to report in Russia.
Sure. And I'll just say that the World Affairs Council of Atlanta has created a charities guide for the public and our members to access resources to support Ukrainians. And we have this whole section on how to support Ukrainian reporters and media outlets that are really drafting the first draft of history of this conflict. And they need equipment, they need food, they need helmets. So there are actually lots and lots of fundraising opportunities just to support media in Ukraine. And we can share the link to that document when we send out the video of this. We have another question back to politics. Given we're 8 months away from the election, how many seats will the GOP pick up in the House and the Senate?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball at my disposal, but sorry. You can, if you graph presidential approval rating against the swing in the House seats, you would get a prediction of about 30 seats that the Democrats would lose, which would obviously be sufficient to return control of the chamber to Republicans. But that's a very simple sort of historical relationship, and that's where you would get from that. On the Senate, it's obviously going to be map specific. Only a third of the seats are up every year, and this year the map is quite advantageous to Democrats. But before this, it was a year that Democratic strategists were looking at as a pickup opportunity, and it might not be that, but what it might be is an opportunity for them to retain control of the Senate if a few elections do go their way.
Is that because of some special elections, like the fact that Warnock is up this year, or what's the reason for that?
It's just the random mix that they get. One every 3 cycles. One of them tends to be a bit advantageous given the mix, and often one of them is quite poor for them. So they have a good sort of selection of races in normal times, but they also have the downweight of a relatively unpopular president. Combine the two, and obviously they have no margin for error. If they lose one seat, they lose control of the Senate. Last I checked, I think prediction markets were slightly favored towards Democrats as keeping control of the Senate, but thought that the House would go, and so that's my current assessment of those things. But obviously, things can change.
Well, things will change. We're 1,000 years away from November in political terms. You actually were a data economist before you were Washington correspondent. Is that accurate?
Data journalist, yeah.
A data journalist, sorry. Yeah. So what is the Economist does exceptional number crunching of all sorts of areas. What are the Economist numbers predicting in terms of the Georgia elections? Do you have any number on who might win Georgia's Republican nomination for governor, and then the race itself?
No, sorry, I don't have that specific number. But I can tell you that the way that we would look at it would probably be to examine the current polling, examine the date of the election, and you can, if you have a model for how accurate primary polls are, you can make some predictions. But one of the reasons that election forecasting has not really gone into primaries, aside from the presidential primaries, that they seem to be much more volatile than general elections. In general elections, the degree of partisanship is actually somewhat helpful in predicting outcomes, because people generally, if they're Republican, they're going to vote Republican, unless they don't turn out to vote. But in a primary election, you don't have the benefit of that kind of predictor. So it becomes a bit harder to get nice sort of 538 style probability models for primary elections.
Well, you brought up Kemp challenging Casey Cagle in the last gubernatorial primary, and that happened just probably a few weeks. Casey Cagle's campaign kind of dissolved very close to that primary that Kemp ended up winning, as we remember. So let me just get through a couple of final questions before we wrap up. Idrees, thank you for your time. We're nearing the end, so if you have any final burning questions for Idrees, please put them in the Q&A function. Mundia asked, do you see the threat of Putin to use nuclear arms, no matter how remote, likely to make potential nuclear powers such as Iran, North Korea, more obstinate in the future?
I'm not a foreign affairs expert, but I don't imagine that it changes the calculus for those countries substantially. Obviously, nuclear arms are a substantial deterrent to interference, and clearly that's to the benefit of Russia. When Iraq invaded Kuwait under Saddam Hussein, American troops went in during the first Gulf War and pushed them out. Because Russia has nuclear weapons, that's not happening. But if Russia were a non-nuclear power, perhaps it might have. So I think that the reality that nuclear weapons serve as deterrent in that way has always been the case, and will always sort of be the reason that those countries are pursuing nuclear arms. So I don't think that you could see a sort of partial strengthening of resolve, but I think that they realized those calculations quite a while ago.
Idrees, what kind of reporting can we expect from you in the coming months? What do you have in the works?
So I'm currently working on a piece about the time that America actually developed a policy to dramatically reduce child poverty, which it actually did over the last few months. It created an extended child tax credit that went out to kids and reduced the poverty rate, we think, by about 40%. That's lapsed now, so the number is going back up, but it's actually, America had this brief experiment in the last year with the European-style safety net, with I think some success, and now it's going. So I'm writing a bit about that. But I'm going to turn, I think, to politics fairly quickly. After that, obviously, Georgia's of interest. Some races in Arizona and Ohio and Pennsylvania are of interest to us. But bigger themes that I think we want to emphasize over the coming months. One is going to be what's going to happen to the Republican Party. Who are the people who are going to win the primaries? What will their roles be when they occupy positions as governors or potentially secretaries of state in charge of elections in the Senate, et cetera? How does this set up the party for 2024 is a big issue. And a second is going to be a sort of more fine-grained analysis of what's gone wrong for Democrats. There's a lot of polling to suggest that Democratic positioning among Hispanics has dramatically dropped, and their position among African Americans, particularly African American and Hispanic men, is dropping. And the reasons for that are going to be important. The continued asymmetric polarization along lines of education level appears to be continuing, and that's a sort of new feature or emerging or strengthening feature of American politics, and tracking that and its ramifications, I think, will be a big one for us as well. So those are some of the things we'll be looking at. Well,
you're going to have a busy 2022 if you're going to tackle all of those in writing in The Economist. Idrees Kahloon, Washington correspondent for The Economist, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today.
Sure. Thank you for having me. Hope that was helpful.
And we will be posting this video, this conversation on our YouTube link, and we'll email it to everybody who registered for today's conversation. Feel free to share it and be sure to tag World Affairs Council of Atlanta when you do share it on your socials. Also, via that email we'll send you, you can sign up for our newsletter to learn about upcoming events. On April 21st, we're going to be hosting former Georgia Supreme Court Justice Leah Ward Sears, the first Black woman appointed to Georgia's Supreme Court, of course, sharing her extraordinary career story, but also, of course, commenting on the US Supreme Court potentially getting its first Black female justice. So join us for that. That's an in-person event. We would love to see you. And you can find out more about that on April 21st at our website and on our newsletter. Thank you so much to our behind the scenes team today, James Kilpatrick, Anna Petrova, and Laura Brower, and our interns, Kanko Zonu and Murphy Reef. We have a wonderful team. You don't see them here on Zoom, but they're working very hard for you behind the scenes every single day. And thank you to Idrees, and thanks to our audience, and we will see you next time.